Hi, I'm Heather.
I'm Haley.
And we're the Dunnit Sisters, a Kansas City true crime podcast. This episode is on the mysterious death of Artemus Ogletree. He was attacked at the President Hotel in Kansas City, and we are in what would have been room 1046 at the time. President Hotel has been remodeled. The bathroom would have been right here instead of the closet. And the phone stand would have been here. The bed would have been where the nightstand is, and the room would have been half the size. The wall would have been between the two windows. We're going to talk about him and what happened during his stay here at the President Hotel. Thank you for watching.
Thanks.
On January 1st, 1935, a man walked into the President Hotel in Kansas City. He had asked for a room facing away from the street, and he was given room 1046, which overlooked the hotel courtyard. Witnesses would later describe him as looking anywhere between 20 and 35 years old. He was described as nicely dressed, wearing a black overcoat. He was well-spoken, and he had a Southern accent. He signed the guest registry as Roland Owen from Los Angeles. He paid for one night, and he wasn't carrying any luggage. So a bellhop named Randall Probst showed Owen into the room, this room. And he watched Owen take a brush, a comb, and toothpaste from his overcoat pocket and put it in the bathroom. And then they both went back down to the lobby, and Owen left the hotel. The next day, at noon, a maid named Mary Soptic came to clean room 1046. She knocked on the door, and Owen let her in. The room was dark. The curtains were shut, and the only light was a dim light that was on the desk. Mary would later tell detectives that Owen looked worried about something or he seemed afraid. And while she was in the room, Owen put on his overcoat, went to the bathroom, combed his hair, and then told her not to lock the door, that he was expecting a friend in a few moments. And then he left. Mary began to clean the room, and on the desk in the room, she found a note written in pencil that said, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes, wait." At 4 p.m. that afternoon, Mary came back to leave clean towels. And when she went into the room, it was completely dark. The windows were still shut, but there was no light on in the room. And she saw Owen lying on the bed, completely dressed and awake. So she left the towels and she left the room. The next day, at 10:30 in the morning, Mary came back to clean room 1046. Mary could tell that the door was locked from the outside. So she assumed that Owen had stepped out of the room. So I just want to say, back in the day, if you were on the outside of the room and you could turn the door handle, but you couldn't unlock the door, you couldn't open the door, that meant the door was locked from the outside. If you could not turn the door handle and the door was locked, that meant it was locked from the inside. So Mary could tell the door was locked from the outside. So she used her passkey to enter the room. And Mary came into the room, and it was completely dark. Curtains shut, lights are off. And as she stepped into the room, she realized that she wasn't alone. That Owen was in the room, in the dark, and that someone had locked him into the room. And while she's in the room, the phone rings. And Owen answers the phone, and he says, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I am not hungry. I just had breakfast. No, I'm not hungry." So at 4 p.m., Mary comes back to the room with clean towels. And when she came to the door, she could hear two men talking. And she knocked on the door, and then a man said through the door, "Who is it?" And she goes, "I'm the maid. I'm here with clean towels." And the man said in a rough voice, "No, we don't need any. We have enough." And Mary thought that was weird because she knew that there weren't any towels in the room. The next day, which would be January 4th at 6:50 in the morning, the night shift phone operator noticed on her switchboard that the phone in room 1046 was off the hook. So A night bellhop was sent to the room. The bellhop, he knocked on the door. He waited a few minutes. Nobody answered, so he went back downstairs. 10 minutes later, the bellhop, Randall Probst, was sent up to the room, and he was told to tell the guest to put the phone back on the hook. So Probst knocked on the door, and a voice said, "Come in." Well, Probst tried to open the door, but he couldn't because it was locked So he knocked again, and the voice said, "Turn on the lights." Well, Probst kept continuing to knock, and after nobody would let him in the room, he said through the door, "Put the phone back on the hook." And then Probst went back downstairs, and he said that the guest was apparently drunk, to wait an hour or so and to send somebody else back up. Well, the phone remained off the hook for an hour, and at 8:30 in the morning, a bellhop named Harold Pike was sent to room 1046 to tell the guests to put the phone back on the hook. So Pike knocked on the door. He didn't get a response. He tried to open the door, and he noticed that the door was locked from the outside. So Pike used his passkey, and he opened the door, and he came into the room, and the room was completely pitch black. But from the light from the hallway, he could see that there was a man laying on the bed, naked. His face was turned towards the wall, and he was breathing heavily, and Pike assumed that he was just passed out drunk. He noticed that the phone stand was tipped over, and the phone was on the floor. So Pike picked up the phone stand, and he put the phone back on the hook, and that's when he looked towards the bed, and he saw a dark stain on the sheets, and he thought it was a shadow. So then he locked the door, and he went back downstairs. 5 minutes later, the phone is off the hook again, and it remained off the hook for 2 hours. And then at 10:30 in the morning, Randall Probst, the bellhop Randall Probst, is sent back up to room 1046 and told to tell the guest to hang up the phone. So Probst comes to the door. He knocks on the door. There's no answer. This time he uses his pass key, and he unlocks the door, and he opens the door, and 2 feet in front of the door, there's a man on his elbows and on his knees holding his bloody head in his hands. And Probst turns on the bathroom light, and he sees blood in the bathroom. He sees blood on the walls. He sees blood on the bed. He gets scared, and he leaves. He returns a couple minutes later with hotel management, and this time they can only open the door 6 inches because the man's collapsed against the door. So they shut the door again, and they went to get help. Meanwhile, at around 11 o'clock in the morning, the on-call doctor, Dr. Flanders, he's an on-call doctor for all the area Kansas City hotels. He gets a phone call from hotel president that there's an emergency to come out. So Flanders arrives at the hotel, and in the elevator on the way up to the 10th floor, Dr. Flanders is told that they don't know what's going on, but apparently the guest in room 1046 has been drinking and he's hurt himself. So they get to the room, and they come inside, and they see blood. They see blood on the walls. They see blood on the bed. They see blood. They see the sheets are off the bed and are on the floor by the bed, covered in blood. And they see a light on coming from the bathroom. So the door's ajar. They go into the bathroom, and they see Owen sitting on the bathtub with his head and his arms in the bathroom sink. And he has a cord, like clothesline, tied around his neck and around his wrists and around his ankles. So Dr. Flanders cuts the cords, and they help Owen onto the bed. And when he gets on the bed, Dr. Flanders realizes that he's been stabbed in the chest, that he has slashed wrists, that his head and his scalp's all bloody, his eyes swollen. And they're like, who's been in the room with you? And Owen says, nobody. And they said, how did you get hurt? And he says, I fell in the tub. He then fell unconscious. The ambulance and the police arrive. They take him to the hospital, and he dies, never regaining consciousness.
Okay, I'm confused about something. First, what time did he get to the hotel?
He checked in at 1:20 on January 1st, and he paid for one night. From what I understand, he came down in the evening, each evening, and he would pay for one additional room. He was described as unmemorable. Okay, so police search the hotel room. They don't find a murder weapon.
Mm-hmm.
They also don't find any of Owen's clothes or personal items. But on the rug next to the bed, they find a tag torn from a cheap necktie, a safety pin, a woman's hairpin, and they find an unlit cigarette. Now, his autopsy is performed the next day, and according to the autopsy report, Owen's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, which caused 4 fractures to his skull, believed to have been possibly by a revolver or a hammer. He had also been stabbed in the chest, which punctured his lung, and he had been stabbed 4 times in the side of his face. He had pressure abrasions around his wrists and his ankles from being tied by a cord. There had been enough slack in the cords that he was able to use his hands, and he would have been able to have walked. So he wasn't tightly bound. The knots were simple, triple tied, and described as amateurish. There were no defensive wounds.
I'm starting to wonder if it's sexual.
Slow down, Dr. Watson. No, I'm just kidding. No. It was believed, or are you Sherlock Holmes? Okay, never mind. Cut that out. It was believed Owen had been attacked 7 hours before he was found, putting his attack at between 4 and 5 a.m. Detectives interviewed every hotel employee and the woman who was staying in the room next to Owen's. James Haddon was a night clerk, and Charles Blocker was the night elevator operator. And both remembered a working girl that early morning hours on the day that Owen was attacked. According to Blocker, the working girl showed up in the early morning hours. She came up to the 10th floor. She couldn't remember if she wanted to go to room 1026 or 1024. She stayed for about 30 minutes. Then she came back down. She left. An hour later, she comes back with a man. They go up to the 9th floor. They stay there for 30 to 45 minutes. Then she leaves, and then 15 minutes later, the man leaves. Blocker says that between 5 and 6 a.m., a man comes down in the elevator. He's carrying a Gladstone bag and a briefcase. Mm-hmm. He is the only person that is described coming down during the time that Owen could have been attacked, carrying any luggage. Blocker assumed that the man had checked out, and that's why he was carrying luggage. Police don't ask. There's no description of that man. He's not asked any questions about that man. Because of the items that were found on the floor by the bed, the police had already had it in their head that it was a man and a woman who did this. So they were too caught up in the working girl. So that's why. That's the only reason I brought it up. That working girl is described as someone who came to the hotel all the time. I mean, she wasn't just that one time.
And they checked out those rooms that she was like threw out there.
Nope, I couldn't tell you that.
But they checked all the people who were there that night that were staying.
Oh, you mean did they interview guests?
Yeah.
No, the only guest they interviewed was the woman who stayed next door. No, they didn't interview anybody.
I would have went to the rooms that she mentioned.
You would be a great detective. No, they didn't interview any of it. The only guest they interviewed was a woman who stayed next door, that room right next door. Now, according to her, the woman, her name's Jean Owen, no relation to Owen. According to Jean Owen, during the night, she heard a lot of loud talking, men and women talking, cursing. She knew it came from the 10th floor, but she couldn't tell you which room it came from. But she also knew that there was a party on the 10th floor. For the next 11 weeks, Owen's body stayed at the McGilly Funeral Home while detectives tried to figure out who he really was. And KCPD, they contact the LAPD, and they found out that no one named Roland Owen is from Los Angeles. And that's when detectives find out that someone matching Owen's description had checked into the Mulebach Hotel a block away using the name Eugene Scott. So then KCPD contacts LAPD again, and they find out again that no one named Eugene Scott lived in LA. So detectives basically gave up any hope of finding out who Owen's true identity was. And that's when newspaper an article about how Owen is going to be buried in a potter's grave. When a man calls the McGilly Funeral Home, making an anonymous call, and he says that he will help pay for Owen's funeral because his sister had been dating Owen for years. And McGilly goes, well, what's Owen's real name? And the caller says, you have his real name. His name is Roland Owen. And Kansas City detectives have it all wrong, that he didn't check into the Mulebach Hotel and use a different name. The caller says that Owen arrived in Kansas City the day before he was murdered, and he arrived at Union Station, and the caller and Owen's fiance went to Union Station and picked him up, brought him to the hotel president, and Owen checked in. The man said Owen was killed because he got in a jam, and Owen hadn't played the game fair, and cheaters usually get what's coming to them. The money arrives at the McGilly Funeral Home. It comes in an envelope with block-styled letters addressed to it, and it's applied to the cost of the funeral.
It came by mail?
By mail, yes. It was postmarked in Kansas City. On March 23rd, 1935, Owen was buried at the Memorial Park Cemetery in KCK. A bouquet of roses arrived at his funeral with a card that read, "Love forever, Louise." The flowers, like the funeral, were paid for anonymously and arrived in an envelope with the block-style letters. Despite thousands of people coming to view his body at the McGilly Funeral Home, the only attendees at his funeral were the funeral home workers and detectives. Now, because of the anonymous phone calls, the card delivered with the roses, and the objects found by the bed in the hotel, the woman's hairpin and the unlit cigarette, and because of the man and the woman coming and going in the hotel, detectives believe that Owen was involved in a love triangle which led to his death. Okay, so who was Roland T. Owen? 9 months before the mysterious death of Roland T. Owen, 17-year-old Artemus Ogletree decides to drop out of high school, and he tells his parents he wants to hitchhike across the country. So on April of 1934, Artemus and 18-year-old Joe Simpson, who was a friend in the neighborhood, they left their homes in Birmingham, Alabama, and they hitchhiked to El Paso, to New Orleans, and then by July, they're in LA. And on August 15th, 1934, Artemus and Joe arrive in Kansas City, and they check into the YMCA. On September 17th, 1934, Artemus wrote to his mom, Ruby, from the YMCA, and he writes, "Dear Mama, I am going to West Palm Beach, Florida Thursday. I got me a job with a millionaire here who wants me to drive him and his wife there in his Cadillac. All expenses paid, plus $15 a week, which is about $340 today. I hope this don't fall through. Don't worry about me. I am doing fine." By October the 29th, Artemus is apparently doing fine because he moves from the YMCA to the St. Regis Hotel, which is one of Kansas City's most fashionable hotels in the day. According to the hotel registry, Artemus was rooming with a Don Kelso, and Artemis's name is written in the hotel registry as Duncan Ogletree. On October 30th, 1934, Artemus wrote to Ruby from the St. Regis Hotel, "Dear Mama, I moved out here yesterday. I have an apartment out here with one of the boys where I work. I think I am going to get my salary cut in half in the next 2 weeks. I hope I don't, though, because I have been paying out most of my money every week." So Artemus has told Ruby that he and Joe are working for a bonding company in Kansas City, and they're making $35 a week, which today would be $800. Artemus wrote home in November from St. Regis Hotel, and he writes, "Dear Mama, I may not be able to get home by Christmas, but I will be by the 15th of January, I hope. I have been working overtime for the last week on account of the elections. I think that fellow I told you about that was going to open a business and give me half interest in it has definitely made up his mind to open in the spring. He is about the best friend I have. He has a big Cadillac Roadster. We're going to Excelsior Springs next Saturday in it, all expenses paid. He made a lot of money in the stock market.
And then it ends in all capital letters. Will you send me telephone directory right away?
Artemus also told Ruby that his boss helped him buy $200 in new clothes, and that's over $4,000 in today's money. And she found that odd because she had bought Artemus new clothes before he left on his trip. And whenever he needed money, he would write to her and she'd send him money.
Mm-hmm.
Artemus wrote his dad from the St. Regis Hotel. Dear Daddy, I am getting along fine, but I am in debt up to my neck. I don't think I will be able to come to Birmingham until about the 10th of January now, as everybody is getting off Christmas, and I may not be able to get off until then. So Artemis's final letter was written in December from the St. Regis Hotel. There's no mention of the job offer in the previous letter, and it seemed Artemus was ready to leave Kansas City. He goes, Dear Mama, I don't want you to send me any Christmas presents as I have everything I need, but I don't know what to send you. I may wait until I get to New York before I send anything. I had to take this week off and I didn't get any money, but I will have a lot when I get to New York. I am leaving next Saturday if nothing happens. Take what money you were going to get me something with and buy yourself something. I have about $102 profit, which would be $2,300, in some stock I bought about 2 weeks ago, but it is so dull I can't sell it. I'm afraid I will lose all my profit before I can get out of it. The next letter you get from me will probably be from New York. Well, something had changed, and after staying 2 months in the St. Regis Hotel, on Monday, December 31st, 1934, Artemus checked out at the St. Regis Hotel. At noon, he walks into the Muehlbach Hotel. Artemus asked for a room facing away from the street and was given an interior room. He signed the hotel registry as Eugene Scott from Los Angeles. He paid for one night, and he was carrying luggage with him. Artemus had the room until 8 p.m. the next day, but according to the front desk clerk, Artemus checked out in the morning. He made no phone calls, and he walked out the door carrying his bag with him. At 1:20 p.m. that same day, Artemus walked into the hotel president. He asked for a room facing away from the street. He signed the hotel registry as Ronald T. Owen from Los Angeles. He paid for one night, and he wasn't carrying any luggage. Less than 3 days later, he's murdered. In January, Ruby wrote Artemus a letter and sent it to the St. Regis Hotel because that's the last address she has for him. The hotel manager writes Ruby back and says that Artemus isn't staying there, that he had checked out on December 31st and he didn't leave a forwarding address.
So over the next several months, Ruby received several typed letters from Artemus, and she had no idea at the time that Artemus had been murdered. The letters unsettled Ruby because she knew Artemus couldn't type. There were several misspelled words, and he was using slang that he had never used before. The first letter was postmarked in Kansas City, and it was mailed days after he was murdered. Things haven't been going so good with me of late. I couldn't stand that job any longer. I told you about taking a cut in wages, and that sure hurt. Didn't leave me anything to spend over living. So I just decided to quit and try something else. I'm sure sick of this town anyway. Dead as a mackerel. I'm leaving here now and going on east. Don't know where I'll stop or when. Anything to get away from this dumb place. I think maybe I can get me a job in Toledo or further east. The next letter was postmarked in Chicago. I'm leaving here in a few days now, and man wants me to drive him and his family to New York. And then he mentioned he wanted to get a job on a freighter going across the ocean and traveling to Europe. I'm feeling fine, and I guess I'll get home someday if the boat don't sink. The following letter to Ruby arrived in April, and it was postmarked in New York. And in this one, Artemus was making excuses for why it had been like a month since she had heard from him. I drove Mr. Jordan's family here from Chicago. Then I got poisoned on something. I ate at some dump. I was laid up for a few days and my stomach pained me a lot, but I finally got over that. Then I caught the flu and I had to go to bed for almost 2 weeks, and I guess I was pretty sick. The place where I roomed, they wanted to write you, but I wouldn't let him because I thought you would worry and that wouldn't do any good. And then he also mentioned he was going to mail home clothes that he wouldn't need to go overseas. The last letter arrived to Ruby the following day by special delivery from New York. Well, I joined the freighter for the trip across and they put me to work already. I get my eats and bunk until we sail. That helps some. I think the captain expects to get going day after tomorrow. And then 4 months go by. Ruby doesn't hear from Artemus. And then a package of clothes arrive. And they're supposed to be from Artemus, but they're too small. They wouldn't have fit him. They weren't his clothes. And then, on August 12th, 1935, Ruby got a long-distance phone call from a man who said his name was Godfrey Jordan. That's the same last name Artemus mentioned in one of the type letters who paid Artemus to drive him from Chicago to New York. Jordan, Mr. Jordan. The man said he was dying from tuberculosis and was headed by train to California to go to a TB hospital. And that the train had stopped at Memphis, and so he got out and decided to take that opportunity to call Ruby. And he said that he was afraid of Artemus, that he last saw him in Cairo, Egypt, and that Artemus wanted to tell her he would be home for Christmas. He said that Artemus was fine, but that he had lost his thumb on his right hand, and not to worry if she didn't hear from him. And the caller knew enough facts about Artemis's family that Ruby felt confident that the caller personally knew her son. Instead of relieving her anxieties, she grew more concerned for Artemis. By November of 1935, Ruby had written to the Kansas City Police Department, she had written to the American Consulate in Egypt, and she had written to the U.S. Treasury Department, the FBI, even President Roosevelt, asking for any information she could find on her son because she thinks there's something wrong. In one letter, she described Artemus as adventurous and possibly using an assumed name because he had previously used the name Duncan.
So the consulate wrote Ruby back, and they said that Artemus never arrived in Egypt. The State Department wrote Ruby back, and they said that he had never been issued a passport. Kansas City police didn't contact Ruby about her missing 17-year-old son because they were too busy trying to solve the mysterious murder of a 20 to 35-year-old named Roland Owen. Articles written on this horrific unsolved murder in Kansas City made national news. And it wasn't until a sensationalized article written in the American Weekly, which showed a photo of the victim's head, caught the attention of one of Ruby's friends. The photo showed a distinct scar on his head. When Artemus was 11 months old, hot grease had accidentally spilled onto his head, and it resulted in a scar and a bald spot, which Artemus would try to hide by combing his hair over that side of his head. So Ruby contacted the Birmingham police, who in turn contacted the Kansas City police, and almost 2 years after he was murdered, Roland T. Owen was identified as Artemus Ogletree.
Wow.
Okay, so immediately after Owen was identified as Artemus, in November of 1936, Joe Simpson, who was living in D.C. And working as a cab driver, wrote a letter to Ruby. I was horrified to read of the atrocious slaying of your son. He was a good boy, and I'm sure he wasn't involved in anything illegitimate. If there is anything I can do to aid in the solving of this case, I will gladly help. P.S. Artemus and I left Birmingham alone. Only two of us. Next, Joe wrote to the Kansas City detectives. I have a letter from Artemus Ogletree sent to me to San Francisco from L.A. in July of 34. I shall be glad to send it to you if you think it will aid in your search for the slayer. It may at least tell you the hotel he stayed in and where he intended to go. It gives an address in New York City that may be worthwhile. I am Joe Simpson, the person who left Birmingham with Artemus in April of 1934. I left him in L.A., and he was to see me in San Francisco several days later at a certain place, but I received this letter from him instead. Okay, so Joe's letter confused Ruby because it conflicted with what Artemis had told her. So Ruby contacted Frank Young, a 20-year-old friend from Birmingham who Artemis had told her he and Joe had traveled with. Frank told Ruby that Artemis met two men while in LA who hired Artemis and Joe to drive them to Kansas City. And Frank told her that he himself had physically met these two guys.
So
He
Frank
saw them. Frank
Frank
saw these two men, yes.
with Joe and
Artemis.
saw these two people.
Two people. And they,
So Joe really went to Kansas City.
yes.
And he's denying that?
He's denying that. So Ruby wrote to Joe Simpson countless times. He promised Ruby each and every time that he returned to Birmingham to visit his family that he would sit down and talk with her about Artemis and everything. But every time he went back to Birmingham, he blew her off. And it took him almost 6 years to finally sit down with Ruby. On December 30th, 1940, Ruby and her husband tracked Joe down at a friend's house in Birmingham. Ruby sat in the car, and her husband went up to the door and asked Joe to come outside and talk with Ruby. And it took Joe an hour to finally come outside, and when he did, he brought a friend with him named Bill Hogan. According to Joe, in July of 1934, Artemis and he were in LA, and Joe decided to go to San Francisco for the day, but Artemis stayed in LA. Artemis was supposed to meet up with Joe in San Francisco the next day, but Joe said Artemis never showed up. Instead, Artemis sent Joe a typed letter. Joe said he never saw Artemis again before he was murdered. However, Joe told Ruby in July or August of 34, Joe went to Kansas City at the same time as Artemis, but they never met up. That they never saw each other in Kansas City. Ruby tells Joe that in August, while Artemis was staying at the YMCA, that Artemis wired Ruby about needing money because his shoes had been stolen and mentioned Joe was with him. Joe laughed at that and said Artemis had it wrong, that it was his shoes that were stolen and that this whole situation happened in LA.
Yeah, but she wired the money to Kansas City.
Exactly. Exactly. So then Joe said two things that Ruby thought were odd. Joe said that while he and Artemis had been hitchhiking, they had gone to Chicago. And that Artemis had talked about going to Africa. And at that exact moment, Bill Hogan interrupted and said, "No, you mean Egypt." Cairo? Okay. Ruby then asked Joe if he and Artemis made any friends on the trip. And Joe answered no, that they stuck together, just the two of them. Then Ruby asked Joe who was their boss at the bonding company he and Artemis worked for in Kansas City, and Joe said that was only a front they put up. Joe then changed the subject and said he didn't think Artemis's murder would ever be solved because there were no clues and there was nothing for the G-men to work on. Ruby said, "Kansas City can well boast of it being the perfect crime," and Joe laughed and said, "It is. It'll never get solved because they'll never get the ones who killed him." And then Ruby later on ends up telling Kansas City detectives that Joe used a lot of phrases such as "you see it's like this" during their conversation. That was exactly what Godfrey Jordan on the phone, the call from Memphis, had used. And so Ruby is beginning to think that Godfrey Jordan was really Joe. And the more he talked, Ruby thinks that Joe knows a lot more than what he's saying.
Yeah.
And Ruby found out later on that Joe had a friend who had tuberculosis and had stayed in a hospital in California. And so that's why she's thinking that Joe was taking things that is happening in his own life.
Yeah. That's why I was wondering, if he was writing about his own life.
Exactly.
Did I say?
So Ruby and her husband get ready to leave, and Joe promised that he would send her the letter that Artemis had typed when they were out in California. Yeah, but he never did. And she never saw him again, and he left days later and went back to D.C. And Ruby told Joe, she goes, you know what? I would recognize the voice from the person who called me from Memphis. And when she said that, she said that he ducked down and like his face turned red and he got nervous. So Ruby gives Kansas City detectives the names of the hotels in Kansas City Artemis stayed in and the names of the boys from Birmingham Artemis had traveled with, all who were friends with Joe. So Kansas City detectives went to St. Regis Hotel and they questioned the employees to get the hotel registration card used at Artemis's check-in. They learned that Artemis had checked in with a man named Don Kelso and that Artemis's name had been written in as Duncan Ogletree. The hotel clerk told detectives that after Artemis's murder, Don returned to St. Regis and asked for that hotel registry card. He asked to have it. He said he needed it to prove to his wife that he had checked into the hotel with a man. And the clerk refused to hand it to him. So they gave it to the detectives. And the detectives gave it to the FBI, and they compared the signature to Joe's, and it didn't match.
Okay.
And the clerk was never able to identify Don from any of the possible suspects that the detectives had over the years. Detectives next contacted Frank Young. Frank told detectives while he was out in LA that Artemis told him he was making his living off some queers. And from that point on, police began investigating Artemis's case as a homicide sexual in nature. So Kansas City detectives learned about a murder that happened in New York in 1937. A man, and we'll get to his name in a little bit, and his lover, Oliver Sincal, had been living together for about 3 months. And the man bought Oliver clothes. He basically took care of him. And on the night of August 17th, 1937, they got into an argument, and the man shot Oliver in the back of the head, and then he took his naked body and he put it in a trunk. And then the man took that trunk to the New York train station and asked to have it shipped to a Joe Marshall in Memphis. And after the man left, the employees at the train station moved the trunk and blood started coming out of it, and so they called the police. So the police come and they open up the trunk and they find the body of Oliver, and they trace the trunk back to the man's apartment, and they asked the man for his name, and he said he wouldn't give it to them because he had a niece who was a famous actress out in LA. So instead, he gave them the alias Joseph Ogden. Police asked who Joseph Marshall in Memphis was, and Ogden said that that was one of his aliases and that nobody else was involved. Ogden went to trial. He was charged with Oliver's murder, and he was sent to Sing Sing. So Kansas City detectives became interested in Ogden because they learned that he had used the alias Donald Kelso. And Kelso was the name that was used on the hotel registry at St. Regis.
And that was the name on that note, Dawn, be back in 15 minutes?
Exactly.
Okay.
And they were also interested in it because that's the trunk was going to be sent to Memphis, which is where the caller who called Ruby, he said his name was Godfrey Jordan, and he called it from Memphis. So there, again, that was the tie-in. So the detectives sent the hotel registry card to the FBI for handwriting analysis against Ogden, and it came back as not a match. So who was Joseph Ogden? Ogden's real name was Boyd Smith, and he was born in Kentucky, and when he was just a couple years old, they moved to Birmingham, Alabama. And they actually lived a half a mile away from Artemis and Joe Simpson. In 1920, Boyd was sent to an insane asylum, and he escaped. In 1932, Boyd's niece and nephew, Margaret and Lawrence Fitzpatrick, they moved to LA, and Margaret changed her name to Gail Patrick, and she became an actress and a TV executive producer. And incidentally, in 1936, when Ruby got the phone call from Godfrey Jordan, Gail starred in the movie My Man Godfrey. When Boyd was arrested in New York in 1937 for Oliver's murder, he had been living there for 2 years. Before that, he lived in Chicago, and those are the same cities where Artemis his typed letters were sent from. And by 1950, KCPD has stopped investigating Artemis's case. So let's start talking about what
prostitution. That's part of it.
I would say that it looks to me that Artemis was involved in prostitution. I mean, I don't think Frank Young would have said that because it was illegal. I mean, being a homosexual would have been illegal. So
Yeah.
I would say yes, male prostitution. They got involved with these two guys in LA. They drove him out there, and maybe Artemis wanted to get out. Maybe that's why he left St. Regis and he went to Mulebach and then came here to try to hide. I mean, it still gets me why he would shut the curtains in the middle of the day on the 10th floor. That's a lot of paranoia there. I think also the fact that he was paying for the rooms each night. I don't think he knew how long he would be staying here.
Yeah.
And who knows? I don't know where did his luggage go. He had the luggage at the Mulebach, but he didn't have it here. When Artemis died, there's newspaper articles that say he had a cauliflower ear, a boxer's ear. And Artemis's mom, Ruby, said that he didn't box. And he didn't have that ear looking like that when he left home. So I couldn't help but wonder if maybe he was getting hit, like maybe by Don or someone to kind of like, to keep him in line maybe.
Yeah. I wonder how old these other guys were.
You mean like Artemis was 17, Joe was 18, Frank Young was 20.
So they're all about the
same age.
What about the
Ogden was in his 30s.
Who's the oldest? One of the oldest ones.
Why were his clothes stolen?
Yeah, I keep going back to that because we can assume that he left due to maybe he was found, right? Maybe they found him. So then he got all the stuff. Yeah. So then you're right. He got all the stuff in. How much time was between?
He left in the morning, checked out, and then he checked in here at 1:20. So a couple hours. They're like, okay, you can stay here, but you can only have your brush and your toothpaste. That's all you get. And then we're going to pick you up and we're going to take you out. He's going to go to New York. And then they're like, okay, now we're going to leave tomorrow. We're going to leave the next day. But then they lock him in his room. But then when the maid unlocks the door, he could have been like, see ya. Why? He felt like he couldn't leave unless if you leave, we're going to kill your family.
Yeah,
I mean, they knew a lot about him, enough that when their letters were written, they knew so much information, which is why I would think Joe Simpson wrote the letters.
Right.
Maybe.
Joe immediately started to try to distance himself from Artemis and from going to Kansas City. Even though, according to Artemis, he came to Kansas City. I mean, I think the fact that he said, well, I was in Kansas City at the same time that Artemis was, but we never saw each other. That's not, I don't believe that.
See, who did they bring to Kansas City?
Wait, what?
Didn't they drive someone to Kansas City?
Two guys. They drove two men. Two men paid them from in LA to drive them to Kansas City. Just two men.
And we don't know the name of the
Nope, the names were never given.
I'm curious about that because somehow, somewhere along the way, they got into, like, in my opinion, they got involved with something with people. I mean,
Well, you think if Joe would have given the names, but Joe insisted that this didn't happen, even though Frank Young sounded dead. Joe had a friend in LA who had TB. But Joe also had another friend in LA who worked for a bonding company, which I think is interesting because then they used the bonding company as a front. And I would say, just kind of changing the subject though, that the anonymous caller who phoned the funeral home, everything that was said was a lie. Saying that Owen is his real name, that he had arrived right before he was murdered, about dating, the fiance for years. All of this was just completely made up, just to throw everything off.
That's weird.
And to love forever.
This is just the weirdest. I can't guess anything.
The details of the lies, or even the type letters, just the little, I mean, it didn't have to be that extravagant. I mean, it's just like, it's almost like I'm having so much fun that I'm just throwing things in just to throw things off. They didn't have to go through all that. Or the caller. Why even bother to call? He lost his thumb. I mean, it's just, you're enjoying this. It's, you know what I mean? Like,
It's like they're paranoid and just keep trying to cover up shit. It's like, I don't know.
right?
Because we're talking about him being robbed. I mean, they took everything he had, which was nothing, except for there had to have been some money at some point for him to sit there and pay for the hotel.
Unless they were paying for it.
And how long was he in Kansas City?
6 months. Artemus was in Kansas City 6 months before he was murdered. And yet, no matter which is why he had to have been in we'll call it an illegitimate job. Because to have a boss, especially if he said it was a millionaire boss, but if he had a boss and this guy's dead, and the boss never came forward to identify him, that just shows you.
Boss.
Who
did they bring to Kansas City? Because those Kansas City guys, they're the guys that he brought to Kansas City. I mean, for them to pay people to bring them, who were they involved with?
Kansas City businessmen, high ups. I don't
It
know.
could be anyone. It could be the mob at that point, because the mob was really,
Pendergrass.
yeah.
I don't know. And it could have been. And then for Artemis then to get away from St. Regis to go to the Muehlbach Hotel. And then he had the Muehlbach Hotel from the day he checked in until 8 p.m. the next night. But he checked out in the morning. The next morning, he checked out early with his luggage. And then a few hours later, he shows up here.
That was luggage.
Without his luggage. With his toothpaste and a brush and a comb. So I think someone took his luggage and said, okay, you could stay here, but you're not leaving before we take you somewhere else. And then the fact that he was found naked, I still think, you brought up too, maybe he was sleeping naked because he didn't have anything else to wear, and the person...
defense rooms, like we said. So
he was
probably
asleep.
Sleeping.
The person came in...
But I think we disagree with I think they took everything because they were trying to stage a robbery.
Right.
And they tied him up purposely trying to stage a robbery.
Right.
But I don't think... And for that to be so loose, they were in a hurry.
Yeah, I can see that.
I think they beat the crap out of him. But, one other thing, well, we don't know. I'm sorry. Because the first time they came in, he was facing the wall, he was laying down. Breathing heavy.
Mm-hmm. Because he had a punctured lung.
So when did they finally notice the blood on the walls and all of that?
That's when he was on the floor right there.
Okay.
Because he was looking for help.
So he probably was trying to walk because for him to be sleeping, all the shit should have happened here.
Right, and it was on the wall. And there was blood on the bed and on the sheets.
But also, if he was just coming to, not realizing what was going on, he would have been like groggy and, and trying to move around and...
I think they left him for dead and then took the clothes.
I thought he wasn't dead. Yeah, took everything with them. But I'm curious about the unless they were in that big of a hurry that they dropped the stuff or they staged it.
Yes, the man wore a woman's hairpin because, he liked it. It was pretty.
A hairpin and what?
It's the cheap tag from a cheap tie. Like it got ripped, like from a struggle. But there
wasn't a struggle.
No, it was all like, do, look, we're going to trick the cops. That's what I think. But he might not have said it in that voice.
Unless there was some type of an argument with whoever came. I don't think whoever came to do it. But this is my assumption, and I hate assuming, because then I'm like...
Well, that's all we have.
I know, but I like to just...
So then, you do not think that he was involved in male prostitution?
Who brought up the thing about making money off the...
Queers? That was Frank Young.
And Frank Young wrote them on later, right?
Well, but Frank didn't tell Ruby that. He told the detectives that.
Do you remember his wording?
He made his living off queers. Ruby told the detectives that she knew that Frank Young had seen her son in L.A., and he was from Birmingham. He was one of the Birmingham boys. And detectives then contacted Frank Young, and yes, he saw Artemus when he was in L.A. He said that, and two guys hired him and Joe to drive them from L.A. to Kansas City, And Artemus told Frank that he was making his living off some queers. But I would tell you that if Artemus was doing that, then I really think that Joe was too. Unless he's like, okay, you do your money your way and I'm going to make my money my way. But he still went with him. But I think because Joe was distancing himself, he was like,
Or just distancing himself because he ended up murdered and he knows all about it and doesn't want to be like he stepped in Kansas City.
The person who was typing these letters, they know details that were very similar to the way Artemus had written his letters. You know, like making the money, I don't like my job, I'm trying to get a new one. It's like, did you read the letters he was writing home? I mean, this person knows detailed things. And I think there's only so much, you know, Joe knew that type of stuff. And then Don, whoever Don is, it's supposedly not Joe, but somebody else, maybe one of the people that he drove. So, but they're so detailed. Again, when the person called Ruby from Memphis, I mean, why even say he lost his thumb? I mean, I'm dying from tuberculosis. It's like, why are you being so extravagant?
That's why I'm thinking maybe he didn't really know that Artemis wasn't Artemis. I was wondering if maybe someone took Artemis's name.
Oh, you mean like a fake identity?
Yeah, I mean, they're always using all these freaking different names. So why not make Artemis alive for a little while and people's phones and they text. And people can tell it's not them texting because you could tell by people's words that it's not them. It's the same thing as like texting back in the day. So he's just writing these letters to make it look like he's still alive and he's not alive. So Joe had something to do with it. I don't know what else Joe was involved with. And I don't know if Artemis was the fall guy. Maybe Joe blamed him for something. Obviously Joe wasn't a friend. Just like all these cases today, it's always a friend that's not a friend.
Right. You don't leave your friend in a city where you don't know anybody. Or just like you don't leave your friend at a party and nobody else knows who they are. You don't let them walk home from a bar drunk all by themselves. Same thing. Except this is back in the day. You don't let your friend hitchhike across America by themselves. I still think if you're using an alias, even Artemis, because he checked in those rooms with an alias, 2 different aliases.
They all use them all the time.
Then that's not legit.
Who are they hiding
You're not working at Macy's with a fake name. You're not working for a bonding company.
So, I mean, obviously he's hiding.
Gambling.
He's hiding from somebody.
Prostitution.
He's running from somebody. And Joe knows about it.
Because he was working for him too, but he was being cooperative. That's it. Artemis did not start, he got tired, or he's blackmailing him. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go to New York. I want to see.
Why did he say that?
Well, because he told his mom he was going to go to New York, unless he's lying.
And how
His last letter said, when you hear from me again, I'll probably be in New York unless something happens. But in that letter, the second to the last letter that he wrote to Mom, where he's talking about having the stock and starting that, he's going to go into business with that man. At the very end, it was P.S. Send me a city directory right away. And it's in capital letters. And so I'm thinking he's trying to recruit more kids from the guys from Birmingham. And he's trying to get a hold of them.
For his business.
For the business, whatever business that he is involved in. And he's needing to get more people into it. Whether it's something illegal. Low end. You're low end hustling. And like you said, you think he's the fall guy for it. For something. Fall guy for something that went wrong. And it's hard to say what part of his letters are true and not true. I mean, because he's saying he's making so much money.
I don't believe he's lying to his people.
His mom?
Yeah.
So he's making lots of money, but yet he's in debt. His money's coming in and it's coming out. And he's working for some millionaire businessman who drives a Cadillac Roadster, who buys him $4,000 in clothes.
Why would he be in debt? I don't understand that part, if he's not paying for anything.
Gambling. I don't know. Or he's not making that much money, and he's really, because he's a male prostitute, and he's
I don't think any of. I just don't think any of that.
no. So then he's where they say they'll pay him, but you have to keep doing this type of job. He's in their pocket, and they have all this control. And then he tries to get out of it. Again, leaves St. Regis at 2 months, because when he shows up, he's staying at the YMCA. And after 1 month, he goes from the YMCA to one of the most fashionable hotels in Kansas City. He's made it to the big top. He's got fancy clothes. He's making tons of money. He's got rich friends. Stays there for 2 months, and then all of a sudden, boom, checks out, uses an assumed name, goes to Muehlbach. He's got that room till 8:30 at night, but nope, he checks out without making any phone calls. And early in the morning, and then a couple hours later, he's in this hotel under a different name. And now all of a sudden, he's locked in the room, curtains are shut. Some guy named Don's coming, and he thinks Don's his friend.
Yeah, I think he thought he was protected. I think they thought he was safe, and then.
And he's paying for it day by day, each day, because he doesn't know how long he's going to be here. And then he sleeps one night. The guy comes in with the pass key, kills him, takes all his stuff, ties him up, thinks he's dead, leaves, puts out the do not disturb sign, hoping that everything, no one will discover him until 10:30 in the morning. But he tries to get help. Can't get to the phone because he's got brain injuries and he doesn't know what's going on. I mean, he collapses. He's trying to get to that
door. I do think he would have been saved from the get-go if they saw him at the beginning, if they helped him at the beginning.
If they would have used the pass key.
He was way too coherent for brain injuries to know what he was doing.
He was saying, come in, turn on the light. Although you should have just said, friggin' help me, I'm dying. But maybe he didn't know. I'm in pain. Why does my head hurt? Come get me. Come in. Nope, no pass key that time. Could have used your pass key, Propst. Could have used it, Propst. No, he's probably drunk. Send somebody else up in an hour. And by that time, he's passed out in the bed again.
Yeah, and he's just dying.
And he's dying.
Please tell us your thoughts and your theories. We know that there's been there's message boards on this, and there's a lot of other podcasts, but we'd love to hear what you guys think. And we tried to make it a little bit unique, and we were really excited to be here in the actual room, and we've had a great time staying at President Hotel, and the people working here have been really nice.
They're hospitable.
Very much. So we've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
First,
Wouldn't you think?
some usually have like a.
We used to hear it turn off. We haven't heard any of it. It's just like stopped on its own. Is it already going?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just do.
I don't remember where to start.
What was that?
Sounds like the door.
Artemus, are you here? That was weird.
That sounds like the door clicking.
Yep. We're locked in the inside. From the outside. Okay. Stop it for a second.
Freaking cold.
I think that was about it. You're getting tired too.
I was just thinking.
Oh, okay.
Look at that handprint over there.
On the bed?
Mm-hmm.
I see that.